Bite. So reading about reading, or being lectured about reading. I like this small little set of lectures from the Great Courses called The Skeptic's Guide to the Great Books. Now, what I want to tell you about this, and so you see listed here, Hamlet, which is Shakespeare's longest play, Moby Dick, War and Peace, which I will never read again, Ulysses, which I will read again. These are all great books, and he's not denying that. What the lecturer for this set of lectures is doing is saying, what do you get out of these books? Okay? Why should you read those specific classics? Okay, why can't I pick something that might be more enjoyable in that it's less obscure and it's shorter? It's very practical. So the first half of these lectures is picking, okay, here's one of the standard classics, which for some reason many people find challenging. So instead of that, and a lot of times they're very long, let's do this other classic, okay? So let's see what I wrote about this. Okay, so good lectures, solid choices for the books. Totally agree. I actually did add several books to my to-read list, and I'm actually going to cover one of them in this particular video. I will recommend ones that he recommended, Dead Souls by Gogol. And I think he said do that instead of War and Peace. It doesn't matter. It's excellent. In many of these cases, these books are good enough on their own that I wouldn't necessarily put it up against Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. They were influenced by Gogol's Dead Souls, by the way. And it's a pity that we never got a completed version. There's so many books like that. I've mentioned Sanditon by Jane Austen, which would have been hilarious, I am sure. It looked like it was just going to be a novel of light, and that would have been so much fun. Anyway, Dead Souls doesn't really finish, and I understand that, like, perhaps some pre-manuscripts were burnt by Gogol or his friends after he died. I don't know. Unfortunately, that wasn't finished, but what is there is plenty to gnaw on looking at what has happened with Russia pre, release of the serfs. The liberation of the serfs. The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, again, I don't remember which one they put this book up against. That is a really weird book. It is short. It is very good. And actually, you'll see here I say Watchmen. So half of this was, here are some other classic books that are short and enjoyable and will teach the same lessons and you'll get the same aspects out of it. Then the second half is we're going to go to genre fiction and we're going to go basically to popular works. So Watchmen is a graphic novel. It's being done as a miniseries right now. I don't know if it's called The Watchmen or something else, because it's supposed to be like a sequel to The Watchmen and updated, because the original Watchmen is essentially set in an alternative 1980s. Okay, that Richard Nixon is more or less dictator for life. It's got so many elements to it. Their libraries carry bound editions of Watchmen, so you can go check that out. So I did say the picking alternative to specific great books was intriguing. It was very intriguing when he picked among genre fiction. And as I mentioned in the prior video, genre fiction is often looked down upon with regards to, say, prestige literature. It's not serious enough, or the whole point of genre fiction is for the reader to enjoy themselves. What's wrong with that? Shakespeare was out to make a buck. Greatest work ever. Chaucer was there to entertain his royal patrons. But they were intended to enjoy themselves, okay? This was not, oh, look how smart I am. Not, it's definitely not the Canterbury Tales. A lot of that is a lot of fun. I'm sure he had them laughing with the Miller's Tale, some of those other ones, and they're really crass. Um, it's kind of interesting. The lecturer makes a good case that many of the aspects of great literature can be found in best-selling blockbuster novels. What you often forget, Charles Dickens was a bestseller, and this was to people of multiple, levels of education. So many of them had obviously not gone to university or anything that would have been like high school. They did have basic literacy. They would have known how to read the Bible. And so Dickens appealed to them. And he also had stage adaptations made of his books as they were coming out. They were very popular. Shakespeare was popular. A lot of the great novelists that we see as prestige literature today were popular. A lot of what was considered the prestige literature of the time is only there for the academics now. So that people back then really enjoyed it. A lot of that stuff we can still enjoy. So I thought that was interesting. I have added a whole bunch of books to my to-read list, and I want to talk about one of them, which I did already read, which is Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. Now, this is kind of nonfiction. I want you to note it's kind of nonfiction. But just like Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse, does it really matter that the chronology that Orwell is putting here isn't correct? Okay, a lot of his stuff that was happening in London, or actually he wasn't always in London, but in England, came before he went to Paris. So that's one item. Does it really matter that many of the characters he has in there, obviously he changes the names of some of the people, but he conflates people and takes several things and makes composite characters. Now, people do that now, but if you call it a memoir, people get a little annoyed when you do that kind of conflation. But the whole point, so I said what I found interesting, and I do recommend it, and it is a short book. My understanding is actually that Orwell wrote the first part about being in Paris and submitted to a publisher, and the publisher told him it was too short, you need to beef it up, and therefore he added the stuff in England. Okay, that is my understanding of how it ended up the way it did. But there are some interesting contrasts, especially since this month, so it's November, I was reading Tale of Two Cities, which is Paris versus London, and Dickens definitely focuses on what poverty in Paris was like during the lead up to the French Revolution, and of course, during the French Revolution up to the Terror. London, you actually don't get to see the poverty per se in London from Tale of Two Cities. Let's go back to Orwell. So some of the interesting contrasts of poverty in Paris. So you could starve to death. And there are parts of this that Orwell talks about, people getting near to full starvation and death. Versus London, you wouldn't starve to death, but you would be chronically undernourished. You were looked upon as trash. That was another thing. So they had the various poorhouses or not workhouses on the parish and this kind of thing. And what it was like to basically be a tramp. Why they were called tramp, they had to tramp around because you couldn't stay at any given place more than one night. You had to move on. So one of the most interesting observations Orwell made about poverty in England was that in the groups of the poor that he stayed with, actually in Paris too, it was predominantly male, like over 90% male. And he talks about some of the numbers that he observed in the various poorhouses in England, and then some of the groups he was with in Paris. The Paris episodes were more interesting in terms of talking about how restaurants at high-end hotels were run. And it's not like kitchen staff are treated much better or paid much better now. at high-end establishments. Mm-hmm. Though perhaps, I don't know, this is true, that the hours are shorter now and you get a little better pay, but it's not clear to me that that's true. Um, Orwell pointed out, and again, these were in the England episodes, so you didn't hear much about charity in the Paris episodes, but you did hear a lot about it in England. So you would go to like the Salvation Army, and a lot of people forget, they just think, oh, Santa with the bell, blah blah blah. They're a religious group. They got started as a religious group. Yeah, they had those like military type uniforms and titles for themselves, but it's about salvation. And so you would have to listen to a sermon to get your, bread and butter from the poor men. And so Orwell pointed out the most appreciated charity giver in all of the places that he visited while he was down on his luck in England and trying to get, not die from starvation, was a parson, so just a regular old Anglican parson who handed out meal tickets. And you actually need to learn about the meal tickets because this may make you think of food stamps now and how they may be used or misused. I don't want to get into that right now. But the parson would stand there and he just handed out the meal tickets that you were supposed to be able to use at surrounding establishments to get food. And the people were invariably shortchanged, and the restaurateurs, the cafes, or I mean, they wouldn't be cafes in London, but the groceries or wherever they got their food, the diner. And it wasn't called a diner then, but the establishment that got the food would go back to the church and hand in the meal tickets and get cash for it. Orwell said, it would have been better just to give us the cash because then we wouldn't have gotten shortchanged on our meals. We would have gotten value for money. The most frustrating part of the book, this was an audiobook. This actually got me laughing in one particular place. In the Paris episodes, there's not much swearing because, of course, people are speaking French. Now, it's not in French. He's writing for an English-speaking audience. There is some in French. There is actually all the swearing in the Paris episodes are in French. You get some merde and some other stuff, basically kiss my ass and that kind of thing. So that's Paris. None of that was censored out because it was in French. But the English swearing was censored out, and it is, I'm sure it's unreadable, but in an audiobook form, it's so confusing because he just could pause. He couldn't, it was just blank there. And sometimes the reader literally said blank. And I just started laughing. It was very, very funny. He did have some instances of bloody, bloody this, bloody that. Those weren't censored. I couldn't figure out what words were being censored. So it's not even like an initial letter and like C blank or whatever. And I couldn't see how many characters long it was. So you don't even know it was censored out. Okay, so I kind of wish what the original dialogue was, but that was when he was in England. It was English poor people who were swearing. So that had to be censored, but the French poor who were swearing in French, you didn't have to censor that at all. So that was amusing. In any case, it's good to consider all different types of books for reading. Yes, enjoy what you read. But also, you can learn something, it can be good for you, and it can be enjoyable. I found this a really good list, and I added like 6 books to my to-read list. Unfortunately, I had read some of his recommended books before, but because I knew the value of those books, that's why I trusted him with regards to the picks of the other books. And of course, he explains. What the parallels are between a standard classic, say like Ulysses, and what he pairs off with it. So I'm looking forward to the other books that he recommended, and perhaps you'll be hearing about them from me. Cheers.